So I will get started because we have a packed agenda. Thanks everybody for coming today in the last week of the semester. Students in applied research have been working really hard on these projects, and I appreciate you coming to support them and hear more about what they've been doing. This class is closely tied to the work of the Flint email lab, which I founded at Iowa last year. And that lab is the expansion of a project I've been working on since 2017, which since its beginning has featured undergraduate research. Over the semester, several of the lab members visited the class, and this work will feed right back into what the lab is doing. And I also want to thank the Digital Scholarship and Publishing Studio in the library. And the Public Policy Center has supported this project in a number of ways over the past year, as of a few other funding sources at the university featured at the bottom of this slide. And today we will be watching two teams' presentations on their final projects for class, which deal both with data analysis and working on some of the project infrastructure for making this data set public. And I'm sure the students will be happy to talk in the Q&A if you ask them more about the larger Flint background and the potential impact of the archive and the website for explaining the crisis. Today, they're focusing more on what they did this semester. And I've taught a number of research-based classes at this point, and one of the most consistently rewarding aspects is watching students grow over the semester as they learn new skills. They become so much more confident as they go from utter confusion at what I'm talking about and sometimes not feeling sure about all the different methods I'm telling them they're about to learn and content. But by the end of the semester, they are so much more sure of themselves watching these projects grow, and they know that they can design projects to answer their own questions that they have. And many of them have become interested in research as a result of working in this class, which is the entire goal. And I also want to note that many of the students' friends and families are here, and I want to say I'm really proud of these students, and I hope you are too. It's always one of the small benefits of silver lining of having everything on Zoom that we can have people come from all over the country to be here today with us. So the organization of today, we're going to have two Flint email lab members who are also in the class give us an introduction to the larger project, and then that will segue into two team projects that have multiple presenters. So the first two presenters will be Terry Saul III, who is graduating this spring with a major in business ethics and values and a minor in philosophy, and Hannah Zada, who is also graduating with a major in sociology. And then we will hear from students in Project 1 who worked on analyzing the coded data. So those students are Marissa Good, a second-year student majoring in sociology, political science, and ethics and public policy. And I did have to email Marissa to clarify that she really is a triple major, and she is. Very impressive. Sarah Berkowitz is graduating this spring, majoring in social justice with a minor in rhetoric and persuasion. Isaac Bills, a third-year student with sociology major and political science minor, and Theodore Burns, who's a fourth-year double major in Chinese and linguistics. And then finally, we'll hear from the students in the second project. We'll hear from Terry again, and he'll be joined by Darshan Smith, who is a second-year majoring in sociology with a minor in African American studies. Two students work on this team, but will not be presenting. Allison Meyer, who is a graduating fourth-year double majoring in political science and ethics and public policy, and Allison Stoops, who is third-year double majoring in English and sociology. Just remembered, I did not introduce myself. I'm Louise Seamster. I'm an assistant professor in sociology and criminology and African American studies here at the university. This is the first time I've gotten to teach this class here at Iowa. It will be offered hopefully every year, at least for the next few years. And I'm really excited to be able to show you what the students can do in just one semester of work. I find it always very impressive, and I will vacate my place so that we can move on to the presentations. And we are trying to finish right around 3:45. It may push a little bit late so that we can take the last 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you have questions, it will be great for you to either write your question down in the chat. You can do that as they occur to you and we can get to them at the end, or you can write down that you have a question, and when I call on you, you could unmute your mic and ask it yourself. So that's how we'll run the Q&A. And I will be running the slides, and so I will mute and make way for Terry to take it away.
The next slide. Well, hello to everyone. Once again, my name is Terry Saul III, and I'm going to be giving you all a very brief background on the Flint water crisis itself, because that's where the data for this project is about and where it comes from. Many of you all have probably heard about the Flint water crisis. In April of 2014, the city of Flint had its water source changed to the Flint River. It used to draw its water from Lake Huron through the Detroit pipeline. Now, the Flint River was not and is not a clean water source, and the necessary steps and basic water technologies were not used to ensure that the water was safe for the residents to drink. Pretty soon, those residents started to notice that there was something wrong with their water and became very vocal about it. Once the story had broke and started to receive a lot of negative attention, the governor's office, Rick Snyder, released thousands of emails in an attempt to try and be more transparent. Next slide. Now, the problem with these emails, as seen up here, is that they were released in PDFs and in pictures, permitting them to be messy and unsearchable to the public. As seen in the slide, the emails came in many different forms and are sometimes hard to understand just because they have a lack of uniformity and organization. Next slide. One of the main objectives of this lab and of this class was to solve that problem itself. We wanted to create a database of the email data that was clear, concise, and accessible to both the public and researchers alike, so that they could use the data to answer their questions for themselves about what happened and what went wrong in Flint, Michigan. Next, my colleague Hannah will be talking more about the data and the database itself. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. Yeah, so one of the pretty important barriers in us making this into a searchable database is the sheer size of the data set. So we have a lot of data. So there's about 450,000 or 445,000 PDF pages in this data set, which is a lot of PDF pages. And for the past year and a half, we've been working with about a third of that data. So about 150,000 pages, still a lot of pages. And so we have gotten to the point in the lab where we're able to extract email metadata from the data set. And so we know now that there are about 95,000 emails in the 150,000 pages we've been working with. So 95,000 emails, probably more emails than we have ever gotten combined in this room. Actually, I don't know if that's right, but anyways, 95,000 emails, and of those there's about 45,000 unique emails because there's quite a bit of duplicates in those, and there's about 8,679 unique actors in this data set. So people who are either being sent emails or receiving emails. So again, big size. So that's a little bit of background, what I said and what Terry was talking about the data set. And really for the rest of this presentation, we're talking about some of the cool things that we've been able to do with this data set in the lab and mostly in the class. So in the lab, we're working right now on a few things. So you can see from, so like I said, we've been able to extract email metadata from the data set, which was no small feat. We've also, so on the next slide, we have also been able to start producing some visualizations of the data, such as mapping communication networks between people, and also mapping email over emails over time. So seeing like seeing when the frequency of emails spiked and when it was lower. And then on the next slide, one of the things that we've been wanting to do with this data for a long time is to be able to start systematically coding it, or knowing it in a more systematic way. So like I said, this is a really, really big data set. There's a lot of data. So it's not something that we can just read all the way through and then write up a summary. But what we can do is develop ways of converting really copious amounts of information and meaning in the data set into simpler forms, or what sociologists call qualitative coding. And so Matthew Butler, who works at the studio in the library, was able to develop this annotation tool, which is there's a picture of it, the picture on the right, specifically for this data set. This tool is developed specifically for this data set. And that's what we have used in this class and is a really important part of both projects that we're going to talk about in this presentation. So this annotation tool is a way for coders to be able to highlight text and assign codes to that text, and for us to be able to output that data and then do things with it. So then next slide. Once we had that tool and systematic coding became a possibility with this data set, we were able to draw on methods from other researchers who have also worked with email data sets. So the other large email data set out there that you may have heard of is from the Enron scandal, or at least I'm sure you've heard of the Enron scandal that happened about 20 years ago. And we've been able to use their work on that email data set as kind of like a starting point to think about what this coding could look like. And so project one, which is the first project that we'll talk about today, we were able to actually manifest this in the class, which was super exciting. So I will let the other members of project one tell you more about our process and the results we found.
Yeah, so now we'll present our findings that Project One conducted on the topic of building a training data set that shows email informality. Next slide. So our group has been tasked with analyzing the coded sample of emails from the email archive in order to create a training data set that can eventually be used to train a computer through machine learning to analyze for email formality. And this is vital because it would take an extremely long time to code the entire email archive by hand. So the machine learning will make it a much faster and possible process to complete this informality analysis. The main goals of our project then are to analyze and test this training set for formality versus informality in order to learn more about the communication network of officials discussing the Flint water crisis, as well as make these emails and findings accessible to the public. So finding whether there is informality in the emails is important because this communication network can show whether officials were taking their job seriously when tasked with resolving the Flint water crisis, how they make sense of company rules and expectations, and patterns in formality over time. So on the next slide, these are a couple of example emails. So to read these in order of how they're sent, you'll read starting on the bottom email, and then the top email is the second email sent. So looking at the top response, this one would be considered informal, and Mike Prisby seems to be almost like annoyed to be dealing with these issues related to the crisis after reading it. It makes it appear as if he doesn't really care a lot about the work that they're conducting, and seems as if he can like respond very informally at work on matters related to a serious crisis. And this is a common pattern seen among many of the other emails in the archive that we found while looking through them. So this is the kind of stuff that a human can pick up from after reading an email. And our goal is to have a computer pick up on this type of informality through machine learning. So next slide. To conduct this research on email informality and create the training data set, our coding process consisted of our whole class coding a total sample of 646 emails by hand using a code book and the annotation tool. And then additionally, our Project One group coded 77 of these emails binarily as either overall formal or overall informal, just using our human intuition. And after getting both of these sets coded, we could then compare the findings from the codes of the informality conducted using the code book with the binary human intuition codes of informality and see how often they match up. Next slide.
help us create our code book, we drew on papers that did similar work and then incorporated those methods. We also thought about what we do when we write emails. Think about what you would put in an email to a boss or a professor and what you would send in an email to a friend. You would write these in very different ways, and those differences are what we're trying to identify when we created our code book and when we code an email for informality. So absent SS and sal sig both refer to the salutation and signature, either the absence of one or it being informal. Again, think of writing an email to a friend versus a professor. If I'm writing an email to a friend, I'm not going to start with dear. I might start with hiya, or I could just start in with my message. Or when we talk about collab, in essence, what we're trying to identify here is texting language. LOL, OMG, TTYL, thanks, THX. Again, words you would not send to a professor or someone in a formal relationship. You can also think about what an English professor would circle on your paper, not putting apostrophes, using ellipses, exclamation points, having incomplete or grammatically incorrect sentences, not capitalizing someone's name. These are all the type of things we are identifying with the codes punct, syntax, and case. Next slide. Both groups 1 and 2 applied the code book to code pages with emails like the two shown here. And right away, starting from the top email, we can see how there is no salutation. It leads straight with yes, which is why we mark absent SS. Also, at the end of this email, there is no signature, and there is also that informal ellipses, which is why we have absent SS and punct. The next email also shows us these codes and so on. These are just some of the codes that we can use to mark informality and use this data to help answer our research questions. Next slide. We started with 2 research questions. The first being, do our codes match our operationalization of informality? And the second, how should we weigh the codes when putting them in a language model? And we will elaborate on these questions more later on in the presentation. Next slide. In order to answer the 2 questions our team identified, we came up with our hypotheses based off of patterns that we thought we had seen and could prove using Excel and other statistical methods of analysis. Our team started with 2 hypotheses. The first being, the less common a code appears in an email, the more likely it is to be an indicator of informality. And the second, of the emails coded with a binary of formal or informal, those emails that have more codes are also more likely to be identified with the binary code of informal. We identified these hypotheses through reading the emails and identifying patterns through our observations. Next slide.
Okay, so here's just show some of the data and tests we got from this email set. Next slide, please. So these are just some basic visuals of descriptive statistics we conducted. So first, we can see that absent SS or missing salutation or signature shows up in over half of all emails and comprise 37% of all codes, making it by a pretty good margin the most common code. And we can kind of partially attribute this to 2 reasons. So one, automatic sign-offs on an email would be part of like metadata, and we wouldn't count it as a formal or informal signature, just absent. Second, as long chains of email replies go on, the senders tend to kind of neglect salutations and signatures in their emails. You can also see that case and collab are the 2 least common codes. So as per our hypothesis, we predicted that these would thereby be more significant indicators of informality. And in terms of numbers, we found that the large majority of emails also had at least 1 code, with 77% having 1 code indicating informality of some kind. And the most common amount of codes, or the mode, was 1 code. And each subsequent number had a pretty steep drop off. So the vast majority of emails had about 0 to 2 codes. And then after that, much more rare. Next slide, please. So here we found some just correlations in between the codes. So we can see that punct and collab are the most positively correlated codes, meaning they appear together the most. And we can kind of see this makes some intuitive sense. When the sender feels comfortable enough with the recipient to use abbreviations or colloquialisms, it is thereby also likely that they are an informal enough relationship to kind of neglect common punctuation. So if you look at the sample email at the bottom there, you can see that the sender is talking kind of more in like a text conversation, which you typically think of with a formal email. So he says, "Hey, Brad, I have to finish that post ASAP, no period." Just kind of goes right to the next line. It's much more like you're sending a quick text message, not normally what you'd think of when emailing a professor or a boss or anything like that. And on the other end, absent SS and style sig are negatively correlated because one cannot appear in its praise. You can't have a lack of a citation and an informal citation at the same time. We also calculated the average correlation for each code and found that syntax was most commonly associated with other codes, which gives moderate support to the idea that syntax might be a more significant indicator of informality, but not complete. It's just something to keep in mind for the tests. Next slide, please. So after each team member coded about 15 emails each binarily as informal or formal, like we talked about earlier, these 77 emails were programmed in Excel via Python into a data set. So you can see in the picture, that's what they look like on Excel. So the 3 emails in that example were all informal because they have binary code 1. And this is despite not having any standard codes marked because you can see that those are all 0. And it should be noted that there are some issues with the binary data. First, the same people who coded the emails using the guidelines in the code books, so the standard codes, sal, sig, punct, etc., also did the binary coding. So this could mean that there was some unconscious bias that caused us to code differently than those maybe unfamiliar with the code book. Second, there were some issues converting the data into Python and Excel, some matching errors, so it might not be entirely accurate. And finally, the sample size is pretty small here, just 77 emails. But nonetheless, despite these issues, it's still good for kind of making a baseline, and these same formulas can be used for future research. And then finally, we looked at the total number of codes, so 0 to 2 or whatever, and how they correlated with an informal binary code. So it was a correlation of 0.286, indicating a moderate correlation between number of codes and informality, which does lend itself pretty good support to our hypothesis that more codes is a better indicator of informality. And then we also coded found each code's correlation with the presence of a binary code. You can see that absent SS was most correlated with a binary informal code, but it also is just by far and away the most common code. So it's maybe more worth looking at syntax because that shows up again. So again, lending partial but not complete support to the idea that syntax is a reasonable indicator of informality. Next slide, please.
When we were working on data analysis and testing, we were dealing with 2 separate but related data sets. The first, which we'll call the codebook codes only or CCO data set, was a complete set of all 646 emails coded by members of the whole class. It only contained the codes from the codebook that Sarah described earlier, such as absent SS, salsig, etc. The other data set was a subset of the first, containing only the 77 emails with intuitive binary codes attached to them by members of the Project One group. This data set matched each email with its codebook codes and its assigned binary code. And those binary codes were 0 for formal or 1 for informal. Because these different data sets contain different data, we were also looking for different results when we applied our tests. The target outcome for composites on the larger data set was to reach a rate of 67% of emails being identified as informal. That number, 67%, was attained by looking at the 77 binary coded emails, of which 67% were coded as informal by members of our group. So we were looking to replicate that similar rate from the smaller data set in the larger data set. And when dealing with the smaller data set containing those binary codes, we were looking for, ideally, a 100% match between the outputs of our calculations and the tags assigned by human coders. This would relate back to our research question about whether our operationalization of informality is consistent with human intuition. Next slide. The first way we tested the data was by calculating an unweighted composite. This composite aimed to answer the question, is the presence of codes on an email, regardless of which codes they are, a reliable predictor of informality? Next slide. Creating the unweighted composite was simple. Essentially, we just had a basic sum for each email of the total number of codes present, and then we applied a threshold to that sum where emails with at least a certain number of codes would be coded as informal, and emails with less than that number of codes would be coded as formal. Next slide. In addition to the unweighted composite, we also created a second code accuracy composite, where we first calculated a code accuracy score for each code, where a higher score indicated that a particular code was a better predictor of informality. These scores were then used in the creation of weights, which are essentially multipliers that make it so that in a weighted composite, codes with a higher accuracy have a proportionally stronger impact on the outcome of the composite. Next slide. What we found is that this weighted composite outperformed the unweighted counterpart in all metrics. So on the larger data set, which had that target output of 67% of emails being informal, the code accuracy composite score output was 74.3%, which was a near 3% improvement over the output of the unweighted composite. Next slide. And similarly, in the smaller data set containing the binary codes, the code accuracy composite had a match rate of nearly 73%, which was nearly a 4% improvement over the unweighted composite. This is still quite removed from the ideal target of 100% match, but it does show that we are on the right path towards creating an algorithm that is able to make predictions about formality and informality, which would mimic human intuition. Next slide. I did want to briefly mention some issues with data reliability and steps we took or will take in future iterations of the project to mitigate these issues. First, we were dealing with data which was coded by 10 different individual coders. So to increase the quality of the data, we conducted intercoder reliability tests early on in order to increase the likelihood that 2 individual coders would code the same email in the same way. Members of Project One also conducted a round of second checks on a total of 20% of the sample. And then there were also some issues we encountered with data conversion between the data in the email annotator, what got processed through Python and ended up in Excel. We realized that we could solve these issues by attaching ordinal tags to the emails when we were coding so that we could tell what codes were assigned to what email on a page, because sometimes there were more than one email to a page. However, we realized this very late in the coding process, so only a small portion of the data contains this information, which is something else that could be improved. Next slide.
So to conclude, this is meaningful research and data because it shows patterns of informality in the communication network of officials discussing the Flint crisis. To reiterate, this communication network can show whether officials were taking their job seriously when tasked with resolving the Flint water crisis and how they make sense of company rules and expectations. It can also show patterns of trust, tone changes over time, patterns in formality over time, and whether some people, such as superiors, are setting the tone. Additionally, this work is a step towards creating machine learning software to analyze the emails further. Further research will also be conducted using these emails, and our preliminary research will be used to extract further meaning from the emails on topics such as formality of communication networks and municipal racism.
Hi, so thank you, Project One, for presenting on your project for the semester. We are project 2, and we were charged with email annotation tool feedback and recommendations. And a part of that project, the members of part of that project were Allison Meyer, Allison Stoops, Darshawn Smith, and myself, Terry Saul III. Next slide. So to give context to our project, we wanted to take a step back and share with you all what we have been doing as a class over the course of the semester. We were given the opportunity to be both the initial users of the email annotation tool and pilot a code book that we developed on a training set of data to indicate email formality. During this initial phase of coding, we gathered feedback on the user's experiences of the tool, both from our own experiences and the experiences of our classmates and faculty advisors. Next slide. So being members of Project 2, we were tasked with gathering feedback and providing recommendations on the first version of the email annotation tool. This tool was developed as a part of an interactive database for the emails that were released in connection with the Flint water crisis. We gathered feedback through a number of different channels, including project member-led focus groups with fellow users, drawing upon our own experiences with the tool, as well as questions and discussions that came up over the course of the semester, this class. And the recommendations provided by us are meant to inform the next version of the email annotation tool through feedback we gathered. We decided that it would be specifically wanted to address issues with user accessibility that new users encountered while learning how to use the tool. To do so, we decided that it would be best to create a new user guide, which we will expand on later. Next slide.
This is a picture of the email annotation tool as it currently exists. This tool was developed in part with funding from the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Technology in the fall of 2020, where we were the initial user starting spring of 2021. The basic functions of the tool is to be able to read and annotate emails that are part of a large data set. We as a class developed an initial code book, which we applied to that training set of data. Through doing so, we came across some areas of improvement for the project. To name a few, an edit button has been recently added to edit the annotations. The previous and next button seen here in the upper right-hand corner are not reliably functional. Additionally, there is no inherent order within the emails currently in the database. So what do future iterations of this tool look like? While we were able to work with the tool for an entire semester, it is our hope that future users who have a shorter amount of time will be able to contribute as well. This was one of the factors that contributed to the idea of us creating a new user guide. It is also our hope that the tool can be developed into a public-facing, crowdsourced research project where users can search through and annotate emails in the database, putting together the pieces of the puzzle that is the Flint water crisis. Next slide.
Yeah, and so to get some initial feedback on what we wanted to put into the new user guide, we decided that it'd be best to hold a focus group. And in that focus group, we posed the question, what components would you like to see in the new user guide for the email annotation tool? And to that question, we found that users that we asked, for the most part, all had the same concerns and suggestions. The number one issue that users faced was simply how to use the tool and what was it used for. They all had a shared feeling of needing background knowledge on the tool. So with that information, we decided it would be best to start at the beginning and assess who our general audience was and who would be the future users of the tool. The new user guide will be used by those from various backgrounds, users in academic communities, Flint residents, and those who are just curious about the Flint water crisis itself. While doing that, we came to the realization that most of our users would not have the information privy enough to understand the annotation tool without having more knowledge about and how to operate the tool. So that's exactly what we want to emphasize when creating the new user guide, making sure that we explain not only the purpose of the tool, but how to use it. Next slide.
After deciding to develop a new user guide as part of our recommendations for the tool, we had to clarify who our intended audience for the guide would be. As stated, our audience that we considered trying to reach were users who had very little to no knowledge of the Flint water crisis. The new user guide can still cater to this audience, though, as knowledge of the Flint water crisis, is not necessary to use the tool itself. For example, as Terry mentioned, we envision this tool being used one day by instructors and their students for their own research projects where they need to code their own data sets per se, or to the Flint residents themselves so that they can inform themselves and gain the insight into what really happened in Flint, since some of what you hear in the media may not have been completely representative of what truly transpired. However, the time constraints of this project would not have allowed us to properly compile resources that accurately untangle the Flint water crisis in this specific way. Ultimately, the intended audience we chose were users who have at least a baseline level knowledge of the Flint water crisis. We decided that it would not be our intention to inform users of the context of the crisis itself in the new user guide, but rather focus on how to operate the tool itself. To try and alleviate this gap, though, we included links to resources about the Flint water crisis to which users could choose to watch or read if they feel so inclined. Next slide.
So the new user guide itself, while we were first getting familiar with the tools, we used the current user guide during class to answer our questions, as well as to use it as to guide and show us how to use the tool. We found it very beneficial and thought it would be a great asset for new users for the future to have as well. So for our new user guide, we wanted to utilize what we had learned in our focus groups. And with that being said, we wanted to include in the new user guide was background information on the Flint water crisis, quick start ramifications, a catalog of functions and basic terminology, and step-by-step instructions on how to use the tool. And what we hoped that that would do would allow people unfamiliar with the tool to become more acquainted with it in a very short amount of time, as well as minimize issues and questions, and overall just empower new users to use the tool in a confident, uncomplicated manner. Next slide.
Something else that informed our group on creating the new user guide is what you see here. This is a project from Zooniverse, which is a website that contains many different crowdsourced research projects that anyone in the general public can contribute to. One component of Zooniverse that we wanted to model our tool after is the fact that new users have to familiarize themselves with the project quickly. All of the projects on Zooniverse have some sort of quick start or tutorial available for new users. This specific project on your screen, though, is for helping to transcribe the notebooks of female astronomers at Harvard. The tutorial for this project is in the form of a pop-up window that walks you through the key information and functions that you need to know to contribute to the project. The tutorial format, or this tutorial format rather, is used by many websites and apps to familiarize their users with the necessary functions and setups. Next slide.
Yeah, as said, maybe not all of us are familiar with Zooniverse, but many of us have downloaded new apps or went to websites where we have been greeted with a quick start tutorial on how to utilize said app or website. And we felt a similar function would greatly benefit our project. While the new user guide itself offers a more complete explanation of all the various functions of the tool, a built-in step-by-step walkthrough on the website itself could provide a good starting point for new users to get acquainted with the tool. And as you see in the slide here, we have a mock-up version of what that could look like when new users are onto the site. They become greeted with a pop-up box, allowing them to start a tutorial. And once they are familiar enough with the tool to utilize it, they can exit out and continue to onto the tool. Next slide.
In addition to the new user guide, we also wanted to include a number of other recommendations for the next version of the tool that we feel could improve the user interface experience of the tool. from different accessibility options such as text to speech and colorblind filters, so we are as inclusive as possible in who can use the tool, to highlighted text so that different users, when annotating, can have different colors to check for things like intercodal reliability per se. A really good point that was also brought up in our focus group sessions, that I also agree with, being that I coded emails too, is that there's a need for a dark mode for those with light sensitivities. As shown in the slide before, viewing the emails and using the tool for hours on end, especially at night when most find the time to be productive, uh, could certainly strain the eyes, and is something that was noted by our peers. Project 2's suggestions, though, include but are not limited to ideas such as ways of fixing the little bugs. For example, when editing an annotation previously made, the tool does not allow you to scroll back up or even see where the annotation is on the page within the text. Being this is version 1 of the tool, this can be fixed in the back end. Another point I'd like to bring up is, as stated earlier in the presentation, the previous and next buttons in the upper right-hand corner work but are not reliable. So there is room for improvement here as well. A solution to this, though, we used in class could be to integrate a new key component to the tool, a table of contents of sorts. In other words, a centralized location to find all of your available data within your specific data set. We also want to suggest a centralized zone for all codes within that specific data set, as I had mentioned, where you can see what annotation goes with their respective file number or document ID. And lastly, we want to see more user interface customizability, such as different color backgrounds or wallpapers, meaning that if you will be spending a decent amount of time here, you might as well make it feel like home. Next slide. Speaking for all of my peers now, thank you for coming and supporting our research endeavor. Now we will move into the Q&A portion of our presentation. As mentioned before by Dr. Seamster, please post your comments in the chat box or raise your hand to be called upon. Thank you, and go Hawks.
Thank you to all the students. And we finished on time, which in academia, it never happens. So I think I'm gonna stop sharing so that you can see all the students up front. I am happy to take questions and I can read them as I stated, or you can kind of get your turn on the list by writing question in the chat and then ask when I call on you. We have a comment, it is praise. I can always ask softball questions. I know you'll give great answers too. but let's see if there are any questions from the audience. Jennifer?
Hi, I'll ask a question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so this is so very, very interesting. I haven't seen this kind of work before. I guess I'm wondering about like the next steps in terms of how this piece will be used. And maybe that's not a fair question at this point, I don't know. But anyway, that's one of the things I was thinking about.
Hannah, do you want to take the next steps for the project 1 and Terry for project 2 as the lab members?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that, yeah, it's a hard question because there's so many directions to go. I think like what I'm learning is that in research, the hardest part is like picking what you're not gonna do. But I know that one thing that we've talked about in the lab is using this as a training set for turning this into machine learning. We've also had a lot of conversations about how we're skeptical about machine learning because of what like meaning is lost when you automate something. But just again, the sheer size of this data set, like that's kind of what makes machine learning attractive to us. So we've talked about using this as a training set. I also think this was a really good, like, just like first trial for coding on this data, or at least I guess some people have coded on this data set, but like, yeah, one of the first trials of like coding on this data set and seeing like kind of like infrastructurally like what needs to happen for coding to be possible and using the data to be possible. And then also, yeah, getting experience with like developing codes and extracting meaning from email data. So short answer is possibly machine learning, possibly just like getting human learning, training for future human coding.
Yeah, and for project 2, we think it was, very, very like vital to get a new user guide out there, being that we're looking soon to put our website up and make it accessible to the public. We want those who come across it to be able to know how to use the annotation tool. And so we felt that the best thing is to do right now would be a quick start guide of, okay, this is what the tool is, this is what the function of it is, and this is how you use it. We're looking to grow on that to make it, like I said, reachable to various audience, maybe those in academic communities, those who are looking to use the tool for their own personal research and for the Flint residents themselves. And so we just thought that it'd be best right now to just get out a new user guide with a little bit more detail and step-by-step ways of how to use the tool. So that's what we're looking to do right now.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? Okay, I have a question. Could I have a member from each team answer? Can you talk about something that seemed hard when you were first introduced to it that now you feel differently about working on this project this semester?
I can take this one for group 2. So I think that a lot of people in the class can probably agree with me that we're a little bit hesitant about the idea of coding. I think that coding is a very taboo term, very computer sciencey, and I wouldn't consider myself anyone that has any baseline knowledge on that. And so I remember reading the syllabus before the class started and being like, I don't know how I'm going to create a code book or anything, but being walked through it and actually kind of, I think I used the phrase at one point, building the plane as we fly it, with just the entire tool and using it itself on kind of a more granular level. It's a lot simpler than you would think it is, and it can be fun. I mean, reading through all of these emails, there's some amount of entertainment in it as well. So I thought that that was a very rewarding part of the experience.
I guess I can take this question for project 1. I had never done any like qualitative or quantitative research before, and so the idea of like actually doing data processing and analysis in Excel was like very intimidating to me when we started this project. And we sort of had a quick crash course in some basic things. And at the start, I felt like I would never know like how this was going to work. But then it was something where when I was doing the work and figuring things out, it was actually very rewarding. And so I found myself just like up late at night in Excel running tests. And yeah, so that was really interesting and also just very empowering for like learning that these things are not as hard as they initially seem.
I guess I have two maybe more general questions. Very, very cool work. One is just to help me orient, if someone could speak to the time frame over which you've got the emails and how it maps to just sort of the awareness over the extent of the water problems in Flint. I think that's something that's in my mind. And I guess on that temporal piece, maybe particularly for the first project when you were doing the training set development, I mean, did you see in your own observations the informality sort of change as a function through that time? I guess I'd be interested to sort of wonder if there was key points where there were shifts in tone and they were kind of obvious to you as you all were doing your data analysis.
Is there anybody who wishes to take on either part of this question? Thank you, Dr. Certain.
I can speak to the second part. I think the first part is still, I mean, yeah, I think this is like a really complicated crisis to understand, like when you get into it. I think like, actually, yeah, I'd be interested to know like if other people in Project One, like how they saw like time relate to formality. I feel like for my own coding, it was too small of a like set that I was coding for me to really like see informality over time, but that's definitely something that I think that we want to do in the future is like see like correlate events to formality and see like, oh well, when this was happening, when like the press was like pressuring them and whatever, like how did the formality change like at this time, and like when stuff was coming out, how did informality change at this time. So I think that's definitely something that like we want to do. And again, like this is like a first step to doing that kind of thing.
I completely agree. I think it's an amazing tool to unlock a lot of those questions to see with time or with particular steps in the hierarchy of who's responding to where. I'm really, you've got an amazing amount of work put into this to help get at some of that. So very cool.
Yeah, it's a bit hard, I think, sometimes to articulate when you're starting with the PDFs. We didn't, just getting the emails in order has been something we've only done relatively recently, but I've been working with this for several years. And so just being able to say first this one happened, then this one is like a major coup where now we can start asking all kinds of other questions. Just to answer the technical part of your question, the emails, there's a few from 2011. Then they go up through early, like February, possibly March 2016. So the crisis broke open in national news in September, October 2015. The water switch was that triggered the crisis was in April of 2014. So there we have the whole period of deliberation around and lack of deliberation around Flint's water source, covering the switch, and then the full duration that they were on the Flint River, and then a good few months after they switched back to Detroit's water system. So we have looked at some initial, counts of like where there were spikes in conversations. We're also in the lab interested in looking at places where maybe there should have been spikes, but there aren't, which could indicate missing emails or a process in urban politics called non-decision making, where things were not being discussed that should have been. So that's the type of thing that we can do now that we've got them in order in our the network side of things, and just looking at frequencies of emails.
Thank you.
We have time for at least one more question. Thanks, Pete. All right, we have, I can ask another question to each to two people who have not answered a question yet, ideally. What is one thing you now wish you could have gotten to in the semester that you weren't able to do in this time?
I think one thing that might have been kind of interesting is seeing how like common senders and maybe how they matched up to informality, if there's some common like culprits of informal emails, or if there are others that are more formal, and then maybe expanding on that into like a network analysis that kind of more in depth analyze like networks of informality and formality, who sent formal emails to who sent email or informal emails to who. And that would have been interesting. And I know that there's been some work done on that already.
I think it would have been interesting to see how the relationships progress over time, just like we were just talking about, specifically with that informality. So like when you think about like how people form relationships, typically like as people get to know each other, like I could see things getting more informal. So I'd be curious to see if that also carries over to this email set.
And I apologize. I had to step away the last couple of minutes, and this might have been addressed, but I was wondering what students thought were the biggest surprises as compared to what they coming into this.
Darshan, you want to take that?
Yeah.
I saw that big smile. I love it.
There's a hand up.
Yeah, no, as I had like mentioned in my slide, I went over this was obviously like the Flint water crisis, was talked about a lot, in media. And going into this, like I had some baseline knowledge. I came to figure out that was very, very small, because you can always learn more. And in the process of like just going through this, like it like reading the emails, like actually like what's there was like the best and worst part of this class. It really just like shows you shows you the conversations people have in their backstage, behind closed doors, and exposing that, or alluding to what this could mean in other fields or whatever, is like something I found incredibly interesting, and something that motivated me to do better, read an extra email or two just to see what else I can find out, because I feel like what we did was very surface level. Like this was version 1, like 1.0. I can't wait till 2, so let's go.
And now you'll be more cautious with your emails, right?
Most definitely. I always think about how I send emails now.
I started getting downgraded on my own emails sent to my students because they were coding them as I went partway through the semester. Harry.
That's great.
Well, we're at 4:30. I want to respect your time, but thank you so much for attending, and thanks so much to the students for doing this great work and for explaining it so well. If we can give a virtual round of applause for them. This is their very last day of class.
Hey.
It's happening right now, so I'm sure they're very excited to be done, mostly besides their final write-ups, which hopefully we'll be able to post online too. Thank you for your interest. I always love showing off what undergraduates can do in a research setting, especially when they're working together. And thanks a lot. We'll see you some other time.